like to ask a question? Oh, sorry, we're now being recorded. For those of you who'd like to ask a question, please request that through the chat function or virtually raise your hand, but please don't use the Q&A facility. And you'll be unmuted when you're asked to speak. Dominic, a very, very warm welcome and thank you for giving us your time.
Thank you, Liz, and good evening to all, and thank you very much for asking me to come along and talk about this project. What I'm going to try and do is briefly to outline the history of this project, which is slightly unusual, something about our conclusions, and something about what I think may happen with them, because I think it is of interest, and then we can have a discussion on the detail, and some of you may already have been able to access it online. The report is available online for anybody who wants it. I was first approached by a group of retired solicitors from magic circle firms in the city. It was towards the end of 2022, who said that they thought that the standards of governance of the United Kingdom, that is the ethics and standards, were so bad that they said if it applied to their own law firms, the people who were misbehaving would be sacked, whereas nothing was happening, and they thought there was a very serious problem, which I have to say I agreed with. And they asked me if I would chair a governance project to come up with recommendations as to how things might be improved. And I have to say at the time, I was very hesitant about it because I took the view that the chances of this having any impact were possibly limited, that we'd do a lot of work, we'd produce a nice report, and then it would gather dust on shelves. But they came back to me in the summer of last year, and they said they thought that at least two of the mainstream political parties were genuinely interested in this. One was the Liberal Democrats and the other Labour. And I picked up, talking to some of my Conservative colleagues, former colleagues, who, including some cabinet ministers, that they thought it might be worthwhile. So armed with that, we decided to put together a commission. It was a non-party commission. So myself as chair, Margaret Hodge, David Howarth was Labour MP, David Howarth, who was a Liberal Democrat MP and then went on to serve on the Electoral Commission, Sir Jonathan Jones, who was the former Treasury Solicitor, Helen McNamara, who was the Propriety and Ethics Advisor to Government and, of course, featured in Partygate, and Professor Anne Menon, David Newberger, the former President of the Supreme Court, and Baroness Prussia, who, as you will be aware, if some of you will be aware, is in fact the chair of the Civil Service Commission. And we set to work really working very hard last autumn and into the end of January, getting this report together, interviewing people, talking to people. I should explain that there's been quite a lot written about this in the last few years, and so we freely admitted our plagiarism of other people's ideas. But what we wanted to try and do was to see whether we could come up with a consensus amongst ourselves about how a deliverable program could be put together, which, if it were implemented, would significantly reassure the public that standards and ethics in government were being taken seriously and improved. And we thought that also, if we were to do this and we would come up with ideas that could be adopted, then it also had the benefit, we actually think the quality of government would go up, because in fact, the settings in which decisions are made are very much improved. And we think this has been a real problem in the last few years of the Conservative government, but in fact, it also goes back much further than that to SOFA decision-making under Blair. You can look at lots of aspects of it. So we produced our report end of January, early February, and we, in doing it, we came up with a list of proposals, and I will very briefly canter through them because I don't want to take up too much time, but at the same time to give you an idea of what we wanted to look at. The first category was about ministerial standards and the ministerial code, which, as you will be aware, have been serially violated under Boris Johnson, because although he has an ethics advisor, ultimately, as we saw with the case of Priti Patel, but also with Owen Paterson and lots of others, he just serially disregards what he doesn't like. We think that the ministerial code should be split in two. Half of it is about how the government operates. The other half is about ethics and standards in government from ministers. The bit which is about admin should be handled by the Cabinet Secretary and the Prime Minister. The other bit should be put on a statutory footing, requiring ministers to take an oath on office, because only a couple of ministers do so at the moment, just actually the Attorney General and I think the Justice Secretary, to uphold the national interest and the rule of law and to avoid conflicts of interest or personal benefit from anything they're doing as ministers. We think that collective oath-taking could be done actually with the King at Buckingham Palace. It could be televised. There would then be an independent code commissioner with power to investigate of his own motion any breach of the code. Final say would still be with the Prime Minister, but if the Prime Minister decided to disagree with the ethics advisor and code commissioner's advice, he would have to go to Parliament and explain why he had done so. On conflicts of interest, we think that the code commissioner should be maintaining a register for ministers and spats, that a similar register should be maintained for senior civil servants with the Civil Service Commission, and that the resources and back office functions should be shared with parliamentary commissioners for standards, and with much better and clearer lines of what needs to be declared or not declared, and flexible arrangements for protecting privacy, and agreed and thresholds for disclosure, so that you don't end up with what some of my colleagues have had, which is being criticised, notwithstanding the fact that they have complied with all the requirements of disclosure at both ministerial and also at parliamentary level. Third area, HOLAC. We think that any nomination to go to the House of Lords should have to have the scrutiny of HOLAC. It doesn't mean that we're trying to change the system. Some people would like reform of the Lords. The Prime Minister will still have the power of patronage. But if the Prime Minister seeks to appoint somebody who doesn't meet the criteria laid down by HOLAC, either because of propriety issues or because he is plainly and blatantly unsuitable, and HOLAC say so, the Prime Minister cannot override the advice that HOLAC gives. There would be set criteria for appointment, and every single person appointed to the House of Lords, there would be a short statement saying why that person meets the criteria that HOLAC have laid out. ACABA and business appointments, we think it's really desirable that people should be able to move seamlessly between, as seamlessly as proper, between Parliament, ministerial work, and also the private sector. But the current system is not working because ultimately ACABA cannot take any enforcement action against a minister. It can against the civil servant who does not observe its recommendations. Again, we think this should be put on a statutory footing, and that every person who becomes a Minister of the Crown should be required effectively to sign a deed saying that they will be bound by HOLAC's decision-making, as long as it's reasonable, otherwise it could be taken to court, as to the length of time that should elapse before they take up an appointment. Political honours, we think, should be abolished entirely. And I should make clear that that doesn't mean that an MP can't be honoured. Indeed, I can think of many reasons why many MPs should receive honours for years of public service. But we actually have a pretty good honours system in this country, which is run by a series of independent committees in the Cabinet Office. We think that can be streamlined. We need to make sure it has an independent chair, but subject to that, it should be possible for the Prime Minister or anybody else to feed in nominations of people who they think are deserving. And I'm sure that a prime ministerial nomination is likely to be taken pretty seriously. But it would mean that there would be no resignation honours list, and we would not have what happened at Easter, which I'm afraid is an overt manipulation of the system, and frankly, a pretty disgraceful attempt at trying to mask a series of political honours behind having a mini honours, in terms of the birthday honours and Christmas honours, having a mini honours moment, which in fact was completely unnecessary and was just used as cover. Again, criteria should be published as to why honours are awarded and in their generality. We also think there's need for professional development for ministers, SPADs, and indeed peers on ethics. Now, that's quite a delicate issue, but actually it is quite striking, and it certainly struck me when I was in Parliament, how many newly arrived colleagues at Westminster often hadn't got the slightest idea of what was proper and what was not, and what might be in breach of the Commons rules and what was not. And that's unfair on them. So we need to have a system by which they can be better informed. Then, and perhaps more controversially, we turned to two other areas, which is about how the House of Commons functions. As you will know from the Brexit rows, the Commons, unlike any other parliamentary assembly I know of in Europe, does not control its own timetable. Ever since 1880s, it's a surrendered control to the government, meaning that even if the government doesn't have a majority, it can effectively try to manipulate the Commons to prevent business being discussed, which it doesn't want to have discussed, and to prevent the Commons voting on things which the Commons might wish to vote on. We think this needs to be changed. Ultimately, if a government has a working majority, it's not going to bother it. And if a government doesn't have a working majority, it shouldn't be able to act in this fashion. There should be allocated time for select committees to move substantive motions on their reports. And we think that humble addresses, which have been abused as a way of a parliament coercing government, need to be reviewed and better defined so that, for instance, working slightly the other way, I don't think the Commons should have the power to demand the advice of attorneys general, even if that is what was exactly done on Geoffrey Cox's advice. It should be possible for the Commons should have actually power to decide its periods of adjournment, recess, prorogation, and in fact, dissolution. I can see no reason why dissolution shouldn't in future be dependent on getting a majority vote in the House of Commons for that to take place. Statutory instruments need review. This was very much David Newberger's pet subject, and he was very good on it. The way we're drafting SIs is deplorable, and that needs to change. And to do that, we need to ensure that there's a memorandum of understanding between government and parliament at the start of each session as how they will handle SIs and how SIs will not, we shouldn't have skeleton bills and Henry VIII powers. And that could simply be done by government making a statement to the Commons and setting out a memorandum. Finally, civil service and ministers, we think the Cragg Act should be amended so ministers cannot direct civil servants in breach of the civil service and ministerial codes. Ministerial directions to act in a way that civil servants think is not in the public interest financially should be properly recorded and made public. They are available at the moment, but they're quite hard to find. And we think that the heads of departments, the permanent secretaries, should be responsible on a yearly basis for and accountable for the operation of their departments. It's quite interesting that today there was something about incentive payments to civil servants, and I think this could actually fit in with this. And we should also make clear that every year there should be a statement by permanent secretaries on the veracity of their department's statements, which includes statements by their ministers. And I think that that will finally knock on the head of what the tendency that has been growing of ministers saying things which are in fact wholly inaccurate. Limit on number of SPADs and proper training and proper employment protection for SPADs in the sense that whilst they can be dismissed, they can't be treated like dirt, which is in fact a tendency that Mr. Cummings seemed to engage in, but he's not the first person to do it. And then finally, we want the Electoral Commission put on a statutory footing as the guardians of our democracy. They should have the power to investigate and prosecute electoral offences, which was removed under Section 19 of the Elections Act 2022 for reasons which frankly appear very unclear. and the power to actually impose significant fines on political parties that do not observe the electoral rules. So that is a very brief summary. It's interesting that the report appears to have been very well received, certainly by the Liberal Democrats and Labour. I have had quite a lot of contact with the Labour Party since it came out, and I'm pretty satisfied that they are likely to implement all the first part of what we recommend, although whether they put it on a statutory footing, I think it's more likely that Keir Starmer will stand up on the first day in Parliament and say that he's voluntarily going to do all the things on ministerial code, conflicts of interest, HOLAC, ACABA, political honours. Perhaps not surprisingly with the Labour Party, rather harder to persuade them that the House of Commons should have more power because they've always been rather étatiste. They will certainly run with the Electoral Commission, and I think the Liberal Democrats will probably run with the whole package. I regret to have to tell you that when I submitted politely 48 hours before publication 2 copies of our report to 2 contacts in number 10 Downing Street, I received no acknowledgement from either. But who knows? I do gather that there are at least some members of the cabinet who are interested. So I hope we may have done some good. The whole idea was to produce something which was effective and could be implemented rapidly. And seeing that the coming years are going to see a time when, frankly, the economic headaches the government faces are very considerable, it actually offers the opportunity to any government, and I would love it to be a Conservative government, to say, we've done a few things which will really make a difference to how the public see the way in which politics and government is conducted. And I really think it's important because, quite frankly, as you pick up from young people at the moment, they simply do not believe that democracy is working for them, and that is very dangerous, and we've got to do something about it. And the key to this is about pointing out that the ethics and standards by which politics are conducted, we can make extremely good and yet still enable the tough decisions to be made on policy. Thank you very much. Very happy to have a discussion on all of it, including anything that you think I might have left out. Hang on, I can't hear you, Liz. You're muted. Liz, you're muted.
I know. I'm now not.
Sorry, I was just
My apologies, Dominic and colleagues.
I thought you were trying to say something.
Well, I was thanking you very warmly, and I'm now doing it again. So please have it twice, one silently and one audibly. Just to remind colleagues, please do put questions on the chat section or raise your hands, and I will look for you. In the meantime, I shall use the chairman's privilege of asking Dominic a couple of questions. My first one is, if you had to pick 2 of these recommendations, and I'm delighted to hear that the likely incoming government's going to adopt almost all of them, which 2 would you give priority to and why, Dominic?
Well, I think I would give priority to the ministerial code, which I really think is badly in need of being implemented. We've seen far too many examples, and not just actually with the Conservative government, of gross violations of the code simply at the whim of the Prime Minister, and I would want that changed. So that, I think, is my number 1 priority. Number 2, HOLAC and political honours, I think, are really easy things to do, and the Electoral Commission. Now, I would dearly love to see 7 and 8 on House of Commons and statutory instruments done, but I do accept that this is a more controversial area. I should emphasise that when we did this, the whole point about it was we are not trying to do some major constitutional change. We're trying to make the existing constitution, unwritten, of the United Kingdom and its conventions work better. So that's what I'd love to see them all implemented. I want to make that clear, but I think if I really had to choose, those are the ones I would go for. And I should make clear, conflicts of interest, I think, are really closely linked in with the ministerial code.
Thank you. As I recall, you're suggesting we have a royal commission to deal with the Electoral Commission, and I just wonder whether that mightn't take rather longer than you were broadly proposing for your recommendations.
Not for the Electoral Commission, a royal commission on the civil service. We were very... was quite interesting discussion, particularly with the people who have been on the commission, Helen McNamara. We were quite wary of touching the civil service because I think that the view of people who have had experience in government is that there's a sense that the civil service does actually need a comprehensive rethink about how it works. It's the fruit of the Northcote Trevelyan professionalisation. It has very high standards of ethics, although those have been attacked by government itself, which is particularly regrettable. But I think there's quite a widespread view, and I accept this, that in some areas it just doesn't work very well. But some of the expertise that's needed in the current civil service isn't present. It's perhaps at times a bit amateurish, and how it recruits and brings in talent, that links in with Aqaba, is important. But we thought this is such a big subject, we'd have still been here this time next year, and quite frankly, most of us around the table, including myself, are bluntly don't have the expertise to make those recommendations. So that was where we wanted a Royal Commission. Electoral Commission, no. We just think it needs to be, we think the Electoral Commission has actually been defanged by the government, but in any case, it's frankly a bit shocking that we have an organisation that should be the guardians of the democratic process. And that means it should have control over the way in which the PPRA and the Representation of the People's Act works, and the power to enforce it, which it has now had removed. And it had removed because I'm a regret to say the Conservative government did not like one or two of its prosecutions. I think that is a very bad place to be in. And why should the public have confidence if they think the Electoral Commission has been turned into a patsy of any government?
Thank you, Dominic. Now I have 5 people wanting to ask you questions. Let me ask John Burris if he would like, as one of our vice presidents, to have first crack. John.
Well, thank you, Liz, and thank you, Dominic. I just be interested to hear whether you considered the issue of the recall of members who are in bad odour from the Parliament itself or for whatever reason, and whether you think that is something which could work properly, efficiently, but also fairly in the instance of a minority government or a coalition government or a narrow majority government, where there might be more pressure on governments to save their wrongdoers, if they are such, and also the wrongdoing. If you look back over recent cases, some are more culpable than others. And linked to that, I just wonder whether, in light of recent events, but there have been events going on over many parliaments, if somebody crosses the floor, should that be a trigger for a recall petition?
Well, that's a series of very interesting questions. We did have a discussion about the powers of Parliament to regulate itself. But as you can appreciate, that is rather a sensitive topic, because the whole point about the House of Commons is that to be independent, it has to be self-regulating, and it cannot be regulated by somebody else. Indeed, one of the features of the report is that we acknowledge that you can have a ministerial commissioner for ethics and standards, but you have to have a separate House of Commons commissioner for standards and behaviour, which we have at the moment, and a House of Lords commissioner. We did ask for harmonisation between them, and we suggested that the back office functions might be profitably amalgamated. I actually think they could all be located in the same building and meet from time to time to talk about problems of maintaining ethics and standards. But we haven't sought to tell Parliament how it should do its business. Now, I think the current system doesn't work badly. I mean, it's the parliamentary, I was a member of the Standards and Privileges Committee, and I think in dealing with Boris Johnson or Owen Paterson, it acted perfectly properly. Of course, with Owen Paterson, Boris Johnson tried to overturn the decision and ended up ultimately with egg all over his face. Indeed, it was actually the moment when his political downfall started. He shouldn't have done what he did with Owen Paterson. It was a disgraceful thing to try to effectively impose a whip on Conservative MPs to save Owen when Owen had been found to have done really serious breaches of the parliamentary standards, code of standards. But we think the system works reasonably well, including the recall system. Now, you do raise one very interesting issue, which is about MPs who changed their party. But of course, our constitution is you're elected as an MP. Now, an MP may choose to call a by-election if they change parties and cross the floor of the House. It's about their relationship with their constituents. But I think it would be a very dangerous move to say that that's what they've got to do. In any case, we couldn't make them do that. It would have to be done. Either an MP is an MP because they're an MP. Where they decide to sit is a matter for them. And of course, very occasionally, as I know at my cost, it's not a question of leaving your party leaves you. Very interesting question as to what you should do then. So I think I would be wary of interfering with that, even though I do think it's a legitimate issue to raise. But that would then start tinkering with the self-regulating nature of the House of Commons. And that is, you can make advice on it, but you cannot tell the House of Commons what it should be doing.
Thank you, Dominic. Richard, Councillor Diamond, if you want me to be formal.
You don't need to be formal, Liz. It's just what happens to be up on the screen. Dominic, really interesting, and certainly everything you've suggested, I would certainly welcome. My concern is the fact that getting engagement within the Conservative Party. Disappointing, but perhaps not surprising that you've had the reaction you have. And any thoughts you've got about how we might push this forward? Because I can see with the sort of bunkerish mentality the party seems to be moving into again at the moment, it'll just be attacked as sort of another example of the woke agenda, and here's the Wets at it again.
I've made an effort to reach out. I know I have to be a little bit careful about who they are, but I know of a number of people who are in cabinet who know about this report. I've kept them informed, and they seem to be interested. And I hope that they might be gently promoting it, because I think it would be in the Conservative Party's interest if Rishi Sunak were to put something about this in the Conservative Party manifesto. I think that it would mark a clear break with his predecessors. And one of the regrets I have is, since his coming into office, that he seems to have been a bit hamstrung by the past and not to have quite made the clean break, certainly on ethics and standards, which I think would be desirable, because I think we have to accept that something went very badly wrong with the Conservative government's ethics under Johnson and its behaviour. So it would be useful if he were to do that. But I can't make him. I hope that my report, or a bowdlerized version of it, has been presented to him by the two people to whom I sent copies beforehand. I am a little bit surprised that I didn't even get an acknowledgement saying thank you. That may be down to their views of me, but I did make absolutely clear that this was not being done in some spirit of getting at anybody. And I actually think it's as relevant to other political parties, because I think Labour has at times behaved very badly in government as well. So I'm regretful that we haven't done better. And if anybody would like to promote to anybody they happen to know in government or their MPs and say, please read this report, it's not intended to be getting at people. It's intended to try to make things better for the future. I'd be very grateful, and I will continue to bang away, just as I know I've got to do much more work if I'm going to persuade, for example, the Labour Party to accept some of the recommendations. Some they will be very happy to accept, I have no doubt, will be in their manifesto, and others will not. Who else?
Sorry, can everybody hear? The sound cut out mine from it.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I wondered if that had happened. Yeah.
Very good. Oliver, you've been patiently waiting.
Thank you. Yeah, I very much agree with the call for new MPs to, swear an oath of allegiance, to the Crown, and that for their own personal conduct. And to be honest, I'm surprised it doesn't already happen. I mean, what would your suggestion be about also taking that a step further back, to require candidates for MPs to like similar oath, similar allegiance. Otherwise, you possibly, or surely you could have a situation whereby someone's elected, and required to sign an oath or make an oath, but challenge the requirement to do so on the basis that they weren't, they've been elected, and I don't want to do that. So what are you going to do about it?
I think it would be a bit difficult to do it for candidates. I should make clear that MPs already have to take an oath of allegiance. It's a ceremony that takes about 25 seconds per MP. It takes about 3 days at the start of a new parliament to swear everybody in. You do have to take the oath of allegiance, and if you don't, you can't sit in the Commons, which is why Sinn Féin still don't sit in the House of Commons. It was suggested and discussed that actually MPs should, in addition to taking the oath of allegiance as they take their seats in the Commons, should also add an extra bit to the oath of allegiance and say that in addition to that, they will maintain and uphold the code of conduct for MPs and the standards of behaviour required as being a member of Parliament. The only drawback to that is, it was pointed out, we might then need 2 more days to swear in MPs, because it's a bit like the queue nowadays when you cross the channel. By virtue of the fact your passport has to be stamped, it may only take 30 seconds longer for you, but if there are 250 cars coming off the boat, the person at the back of the queue is about an hour. It's much, much longer. So we thought that the focus should be on ministers. It is very bizarre. I know that when a prime minister goes to become prime minister, he kisses hands on appointment, it's called, but actually he doesn't do anything. And famously, I've got a nice story that when David Cameron turned up to be foreign secretary, he actually received seals of office. He was a bit surprised because as prime minister, nobody had given him anything. And the only 2 ministers who do have to take oaths are the Lord Chancellor to uphold the rule of law and the Attorney General to do something rather similar. And of course, those are done in front of the judiciary, which is correct for them. But we think all ministers, including junior ministers, when the Prime Minister has finished his appointments list, everybody should troop off to Buckingham Palace. The King might even provide tea and cucumber sandwiches, which he does before a Privy Council meeting, and say hello to everybody and wish them well. And somebody should administer an oath. It means they don't have to do it personally, saying that they will uphold the ministerial code, which is a statute. I think it would be really quite powerful. And it's a ceremony that could even be televised. I think it would be perfectly possible to do it. And people would know the new ministers have gone to be sworn in by the king. And lots of other countries do it who have monarchs. Again, it's a rather odd aspect of our unwritten constitution that for reasons which are very unclear, it doesn't really happen here, because the only person who's seen as being necessary, if you do have to go in front of the king if you're going to be made a Privy Councillor, but once you're made a Privy Councillor, you never have to go back. And we think you could be improved on.
Thank you. Robert, good evening.
Me? Is that me?
Yes, you, sorry.
Hello, Robert.
I agree with very much what you are saying. But although, I mean, my real biases in terms of needs are really what you sort of said was beyond you, which is I really think the House of Lords should be elected. I know perfectly well the House of Commons will not do that. And indeed, there's a question there because, of course, the House of Commons is not unbiased on that subject. But in a way, I agree that's an irrelevance. And I do agree with you that, the last few years we've had quite a lot of appalling appointments to the House of Lords, etc., etc., and political appointments to, lots of Conservative workers and so forth, which I hasten to add, I've never had. But I just wonder if there isn't a danger of looking a bit too nannying and a bit too too many rules coming forth on this, that there is to some extent an allowance for the Prime Minister to have some sort of scope. And we do have to be careful on that, even although it may be doing things, appointing things we are horrified about.
Yeah, well, I agree with that. And we steered absolutely clear of House of Lords reform. Bear in mind that for the Labour Party, Gordon Brown brought out this massive document, which I have to say, I don't think is going to be implemented by Keir Starmer at all. I mean, everybody said thank you to him, but I just don't think, I think it's way beyond. Firstly, if you're asking for my personal opinion, I think that although I can understand the thoughts of having an elected second chamber, it's never going to happen. So if I were being asked how I would reform the House of Lords, I would go to a statutory system of appointment, which would remove the Prime Minister's patronage power so that the Prime Minister could feed in names of people he wanted in the Lords, but ultimately an independent commission would determine who goes to the Lords and who doesn't. And the Lords would have a statutory remit to set out no political party overall majority, a substantial number of independent peers, between 400 and 600 peers maximum, so there's some flexibility, recognition that an incoming Prime Minister may wish to appoint new peers to act as ministers in the Lords, and recognition that that should be given a degree of recognition and priority, and one or two other things you could put in, and I just let them get on with it. But we weren't going to go there, because if we'd started going there, then you would have brought in alternatives of elected second chamber. So this is pretty minimalist. Our point is that HOLAC already appoint a very limited number of independent peers, 2 a year, the people's peers, to set criteria. And the criteria are, in fact, available. And we just think that exactly the same criteria should apply to anybody being appointed to the Lords. So, for example, I have absolutely no doubt David Cameron's name was submitted to HOLAC. And I'm sure that HOLAC had no difficulty deciding that David Cameron was a completely suitable person to go to the Lords if that's what the Prime Minister wanted. And that's what the system we should have. But what we should not have is a system which applied in the case of at least one Conservative peer, where the HOLAC said, he's completely unsuitable, and there are really reputational reasons why this person should not be appointed, and was just ignored. And that has got to stop, and I think that can be stopped. But it would still leave the existing patronage system in the hands of the PM. Want to make that quite clear? Does that make me very happy? No, but it wasn't the object of our inquiry and our commission. We wanted to keep this existing system. How can we improve it?
Thank you, Dominic. Peter Burke, do you want to ask your question personal, or would you like me to read it? Well, he seems to have vanished. I'll try reading it. But,
can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Hello,
yes. Hello, Peter.
Yeah. So, Dominic, well spoken, and I think I agree with all of the suggestions that you've made. I think we need something like that. The pity is it should be necessary to say those things in the first place, because in private business, it'd be taken for granted. And of course, we know that MPs are getting away with lies that anywhere else would be considered sufficient grounds for dismissal, if not conviction. And part of the problem, I think, is that the government has taken not only the teeth of the Electoral Commission, but also of the courts. And that applies in the Judicial Review Act, and also most recently, and notoriously so, in the Miranda Act, which is telling the courts what to think. Do you have any thoughts about how that can be changed, and is it overdue?
Well, I think so far as judicial review is concerned, yes, they have tried to tinker with it. But I have to say, I haven't seen any real sign that that is going to has altered the court's approach. I think it's a bit of a damp squib. That said, Labour may decide to repeal those bits. I have no idea. Clearly, as you'll be aware, what is said in the House of Commons is unimpeachable in the courts. And as it's such a basic building block of our Constitution and the Bill of Rights, if a minister stands up at the dispatch box and says, the army has 750 tanks when it only has 200, and he knows and that's a lie, he's got to correct the record. If he doesn't correct the record, it's a breach of parliamentary standards, and indeed he could be expelled. That's actually what happened to Boris. Remember that Boris's expulsion from the Commons, effectively his suspension for long enough to make his expulsion almost inevitable, was because he lied about Partygate. And he lied to the House. Now, we were interested in lies outside of the House. Now, it is possible that you can tell a lie outside of the House and it's not actually justiciable in some way. It might be possible to review a decision, but it's not necessarily so. But that's why we had the bit about the permanent secretary producing an annual statement vouching for the truth of statements made on behalf of the department, because that covers ministers. And I think most ministerial statements are not made off the cuff. And I think it would have the consequence that the Perm Sec would say, well, I'm terribly sorry, Secretary of State, but you want to say this, and you can't, because it's just not true. And I think one's got to remember that it's likely to be much more nuanced than a straight black and white issue. Of course, sometimes ministers can't tell the whole truth for national security reasons, and you have to have such an exception. But outside of that, ministers should be telling the truth. And I think that this provides a mechanism by which you can deal with it.
Thank you. Nicholas, good evening. Nicholas McLean, you need to
I've unmuted.
Yes, thank you.
Dominic, could I ask you to talk about the powers of the government's ethics advisor, thinking of the case of Christopher Geit, and also the very long delay before Sir Laurie Magnus was appointed to take his place. First of all, do you support more independence being given to the role of the ethics advisor? And secondly, is there a way of tying the Prime Minister's or the government's hands so that they can't, for an unreasonable time, delay appointing someone to replace a resigning ethics advisor, as in the case which I've just mentioned?
Yes, absolutely, and it's covered in the report. What we want to do is to put the Ethics and Standards Commissioner on a statutory footing. And so what would happen, there would be a statute saying there will be an Ethics and Standards Commissioner. He's appointed through the senior appointments process. So he is not the Prime Minister's sort of poodle. It's not somebody who's been plucked out by the Prime Minister. Somebody said, this is Prime Minister, this is your independent ethics advisor. He is there to see that the ministerial code is being implemented and worked properly, and that conflicts of interest are being handled properly. He has power to investigate irrespective of the Prime Minister's wishes, and he will have power to make a report to the Prime Minister. He will also make a report, we suggest, annually to Parliament about his work. What he won't have, because I think if we were to do this, it would undermine a key part of our Constitution, he doesn't have the power to say, the Secretary of State for the Environment has transgressed and he has got to be sacked. He would have power to say to the Prime Minister, the Secretary of State for the Environment has transgressed, he isn't fit for office, and you should be considering his removal. If the Prime Minister then chooses to keep the Secretary of State in post, the Prime Minister would have to explain himself, but he would have the power to do that, because otherwise we're going to end up with a situation where the Ethics and Standards Advisor is in control. So he would be a very important figure for ministers, for SPADs, less so for civil servants, but he would have extensive power to make sure that the ministerial code is being operated correctly. And I think he could actually be really helpful to ministers on conflicts of interest issues, because there's no doubt that sometimes I think it is very opaque how the conflicts of interest system is supposed to work. I realized this myself when I was Attorney General, but a lot of it is ad hoc and is not well laid down. And to have a central figure who can deal with this, who is independent of the cabinet office, would be really worthwhile.
But what about the second point I raised, avoiding a long delay in?
Oh yeah, well, there would have to be in post. So I mean, you would expect that there would always be an ethics and standards advisor in post. There would never be a period which is without one. I mean, I can see that it might happen if an ethics and standards advisor resigned unexpectedly or died in post. There would be a hiatus, but presumably that the post would have a deputy of some sort who could take over in the absence of the ethics and standards advisor. It would be a small department. I say department. It would be an office. So I would expect there would be a deputy who could take over. So you shouldn't be a period where you are without an ethics and standards advisor. And certainly the Prime Minister wouldn't be in a position to say, I'm not going to have one.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, Adam. Thank you for being patient. Fire away. Oh, Adam? You're still muted. Adam, you need to unmute. Because we don't do lip reading.
Well, I could try, but I'm not sure I'd be very good at it.
All right, I stand corrected, Dominic. I don't do lip reading. Adam?
Yeah, it's the button. It's the button with the red line through it. We've lost him.
It's Brussels for you.
My computer microphone isn't working, he says. I've got him.
Ah.
So unless he wants to send the question.
Adam, you could type the question and we'll ask it. Okay.
And we'll take somebody else and come back to you.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what he's going to do. There's the European Parliament for you. I'm just trying to... well, in the absence of anyone else... Will. Natural. Let's hope your microphone's working.
Hello, is that working?
That's perfect, Will.
Thank you. I had a small question about the humble address proposal, Dominic. Are you proposing to alter the procedural rules of the Commons in some way to achieve that? Or just say that... Go ahead, sorry.
It would have to be an alteration. We will recommend that there should be a change to the procedural rules of the Commons. The humble address is a very powerful tool. And as you'll be aware, under Theresa May's government, she suffered humble addresses, some of which were, in my view, highly pertinent. When I was indulged in one, I demanded to see the phone communications of Dominic Cummings and about how they plotted prorogation, because it was quite obvious that the government had lied about prorogation and when it had first been planned. I think that was legitimate, although it is trauma to the SPADs about their behaviour. Labour, it didn't happen. But I was much more concerned over the humble address seeking Geoffrey Cox's advice. I know some people may disagree with this, but I really think that there are good reasons why the government should be able to get legal advice and not have it disclosed. This would be a matter that would have to be discussed within Parliament, but I think that what you'd simply do is that you change the standing orders of the Huntington Rules of the House to say that without the Speaker's permission or in some formula, you can't bring a humble address in certain very limited categories, for example, on national security grounds. And the reality is that the government, you then get into a ping pong with the government. It's not a good place to be. I think it could just be gently streamlined so people know where they stand.
Thank you. And if I may, I can see why you didn't touch this in the project because you focused on sort of the state apparatus, but were you tempted to talk about party leadership selection, given how they end up affecting what happens in Parliament?
No, I think actually we weren't, because I mean, that is extraordinarily difficult to handle. Our constitution is that a Parliament is elected. and a ministry is formed from the Parliament, which is answerable to Parliament and commands Parliament's confidence. And as long as it commands Parliament's confidence, it can hold office. It is, of course, only a convention that if it loses the confidence of Parliament, it has to resign, something which did start to crop up with Johnson, because he was suggesting that even if he lost a vote of no confidence, he would stay in Downing Street in October till a no-deal Brexit had happened. Although I think he would probably have found that there would have been a way he wouldn't have been able to do that, although it would have caused a major constitutional crisis. But I think we can't interfere. I mean, you could, I suppose, introduce a significant constitutional change that every prime minister appointed, there has to be a immediate vote of confidence in their appointment by the Commons. But in a sense, that's what we get anyway, because you could have an immediate vote of no confidence. So I think one has to assume that if a prime minister is able to hold office, it's because they have been facilitated by doing so by having a Commons majority. So to say that if a prime minister resigns, you have to have a general election and a new prime minister with a new mandate, that would be interfering with the constitution, and I'm not sure it would be a good idea.
Thank you. We have 2 questions to go and not very many minutes, so
I'll be quick.
Well, actually, it wasn't you I was having. It might be because the questions Adam sent it through, and they may feel that outside the scope of the commission, but interesting.
Adam's question is covered, and I'm sorry, perhaps I didn't go into enough detail, but Adam's question, which is about standing orders.
No, that's fine.
I'll read it out. Is there any prospect of amending them to allow the Commons to control its agenda more like we do in the European Parliament? Also, if the works on the Palace of Westminster ever happen, can the voting procedures be changed so they don't take 20 minutes each, which might also allow more amendments to be voted, thus potentially avoiding incidents like the Opposition Day debate on Gaza, when only one motion was voted, rather than all those motions amendments that were admissible we voted on. Two halves to it. First half, standing orders. Yes, the standing orders can be amended, and what we are saying, and this is the one where I think Labour is less favourable, we're saying the House of Commons should have greater control over its business. Now, it should still have in the standing orders the facility to enable government to have a lot of time of the order paper, but it shouldn't have the exclusive control it has at the moment, which then has to be wrested from it when it loses its majority. And I think there should be much more cooperative discussion between government and the House of Commons Business Committee about how the business of the House is conducted. The other example, which I think should change, is you may recall under Theresa May that we started having 2-year parliamentary sessions. That meant that oppositions are given a number of days in each session when they have opposition day debates. But if you have a 2-year session, it's programmed for a 1-year session, they run out of opposition day debates. And it was a tool of control of the House of Commons by Theresa and Julian Smith. Julian's a very good friend, but he controlled it by not giving the Labour Party opposition day debates, which I have to say, I think is unacceptable in a modern parliamentary democracy. So yes, we think that should be changed. Voting procedure, I'm not so sure about. There has been a change. It's happened since I left. You now vote with a swipe card, and that has, I'm told, greatly shortened the voting period. But what we do insist on is that people turn up in person to vote, because the risk is that if you don't do that, MPs will simply not attend Parliament at all. They'll sit around at home or in their office or wherever else it is, voting from there. And I do think actually the presence in voting is quite important. And I'm not sure that it's the length of the votes which prevented the opposition day debate on Gaza being voted on. That was a procedural issue. And of course, also the Speaker broke convention on the procedures. It's all rather complicated, but it wasn't about the time available for voting. I have at times in the Commons stayed at the end of a day's debate and voted on 8 or 9 amendments chosen by the Speaker, and the voting can go on a long time.
Now, I know you've got a dinner to get to. Have you time for one more question?
Yes, I have time for one more question. Yep.
Dan,
Dominic, you mentioned statutory instruments and skeleton bills. We've seen so many of them go through. Do you really think it's realistic that an incoming government is going to give up this extremely attractive way of governing in shorthand and having the ability to legislate after the fact, and will inherit many, many bills that they can activate and tinker with via SI?
Well, it may be wishful thinking, because I recognise that power is a thing that governments like exercising, including the power of using statutory instruments for matters that ought to have primary legislation. But look what happened over COVID. The results were awful. And I was very struck by David Neuberger and his view, as a senior judge, about the rubbish that is appearing in the courts for their interpretation as a consequence. So the argument would be a wise government would have a self-denying ordinance. And our recommendation is effectively they would have a memorandum of understanding with the Commons Business Committee. And there would be a statement at the start of each bill as to how the bill, in respect of SIs, met the requirement of the MOU. There would be no skeleton bills, except in exceptional circumstances justified by government or Henry VIII powers, and there would be better opportunities to scrutinise SIs, including pre-scrutiny, because remember, an SI can't be amended. One of the real problems you have is you're presented with a statutory instrument which is really needed. It's got something in it which is really bad, and I know what happens. The government says, we really need this. You're going to have to vote for it because we need it. Oh, we'll think about correcting the error further down the track. I mean, sometimes they're not even things which are bad. They are things which the government itself accepts are erroneous, and they do nothing about it. And I think all that could be greatly improved, but it is, I have to accept, encouraging government to think creatively and with a bit of a self-denying ordinance. And if they don't want to do it, well, with a supine House of Commons, because they couldn't have a majority, it probably won't happen. But it's worth the attempt. We set it out. And I know that David Neuberger is busy doing his own networking on the Commission's behalf, saying, please listen. This isn't just the politicians saying this. There are others on this Commission who think this very strongly.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for all the questions and for the very full answers, Dominic. We are very grateful to you for having come, and I have made a note promoting the work of the Good Governance Project through CEF.
Thank you.
We would indeed do that for you with pleasure. Three upcoming events, which some of you may want to note for your diaries. Robert Buckland is speaking to us on the 21st of May. Professor Timothy Garton-Ash is going to speak to us about Russia and Europe on the 13th of June. And it is, of course, our AGM, followed by a reception with Alex Chalk on the 19th of June, where I very much hope we will see you all. Obviously, the AGM is only open to members, but members are welcome to bring a guest to the reception. And as usual, if any of you are not a member would like to be, please go to our website, which is www.conservativeeuropeanforum.com. And on that note, thank you all very much for attending. Thank you very much indeed for speaking and answering questions, Dominic. And I wish you all a happy Europe Days evening.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure doing it. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.